Today we're talking about design systems, something that you know a lot about and something that is a big part of our day-to-day, helping our clients. What they are is some of the stuff we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what they are, how to get started with it, some of the more advanced stuff too, I think we're going to touch on, and just in general try to make design systems very approachable for our audience. So, to make sure we're all on the same page here, us and the listeners, when we say design systems, both at EDL, but also you personally, what does that mean?
Well, this is, again, very nuanced question. And the problem with the design system definition as of now, like the state of it, is that there's no such thing as a standardized design definition. As of now, at least, the people in the industry don't really necessarily agree what it is, and they will tell you different things. And depending on who you ask, you'll have different answers. So if you spoke to a designer, well, we did that little exercise last week, and most of you guys, when I asked that question, you mentioned a lot of different design-related building blocks. If you ask that same question to a developer, they will most likely talk about, front-end development assets and such. So I like to simplify the definition and kind of abstract it to the point that is a little bit more inclusive, and it can really be applied to, many different organizations. So at its core, a design system is a set of building blocks or elements that are interconnected, and all of them together, they are serving the development of a digital product or a service.
Nice. Okay, so to make it, I like the very simplified and abstract definition of a design system, but to make it a bit more tangible for a product owner or a CTO or a CPO or a founder maybe, in your opinion, in our day-to-day work, what would you define as being some of the key components that, no matter the size of the organization or the complexity of the product, what kind of key components would you expect to have in a design system?
So the first thing that I would expect to have in a design system, and no matter of the size of our organization, is actually a Git repository where we have a set of reusable design components the developers can just import straight to their project. And after that, we can talk about style definition in Figma. Maybe we have a set of libraries for our spacing presets and colors and typography, etc. And then again, we might have different files. It can be a single file, it can be a set of files of component libraries or so-called UI kits. But again, without that the main thing that is Git repository or a component library that developers use in their day-to-day, we don't really need the other things, right? So that's the way I look at it. And then all the documentation and the guidelines it's more of a, in my opinion, nice to have. It becomes more important when we talk about bigger organizations, but for smaller organizations, it's not really that big of a concern.
Okay. So it's funny listening to a designer be very focused on the development side of things, heavily focused. Normally, in most cases, I think when we, at least nowadays, talk about design systems, it's a lot about Figma. Like it's a Figma file or it's a set of Figma files. So I love that you have such a huge focus on developers, because without them, we don't really have anything. So that's a great point, I think. In your opinion, if you had to, which kind of, what part of a design system adds the most value, you would say, maybe besides the code base or the actual code from a design perspective, maybe?
Yeah, I think, the biggest value is that we're able also as a designers to actually iterate faster, right? So it kind of speeds up the entire, again, I'm going to repeat myself, product development process. Another thing that is quite crucial, especially like for startups, it's if you have a solid foundation in place, as soon as you're going to get some investor money and you're going to be starting to grow, you'll be prepared for that exponential growth, because design system really allows you to scale much faster. And I think that's kind of one of the main values design systems. Speaking of, smaller companies.
Yeah, so having a set of high quality design assets in Figma, for example, where a designer or a product owner or somebody who's just efficient in Figma can play around and create stuff and make sure that everything is streamlined because the design aspect has been taken care of. So we know how buttons look and we know how input fields feel. So that's one of the most important assets from a design perspective, as I hear you.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah. In terms of business value, I love talking business value. We in general love talking business value. And I think it's one of the things that often we miss in the conversation when we talk design, because design is not just colors and shapes and layouts. So in terms of business value, you mentioned it a bit. My favorite business value, and the one that you see the quickest, is usually reduced development time. And you just touched upon it earlier in terms of we're able to streamline stuff as designers, which inevitably would result in developers being quicker because they don't have to adjust everything every single time. From your perspective, and from a startup perspective, maybe that's more interesting, what do you feel like business value-wise? What provides the biggest value add for a startup?
Well, first of all, I would agree with you in terms of like cutting down the development cost and making it faster. I think this is like the biggest value of a design system. But also sometimes we tend to forget that design systems also might increase user satisfaction, right? Especially maybe our design system is focused. We have some sort of accessibility guidelines in there, and so we're becoming more inclusive as our organization, and we include more and bigger variety of segments. So I think, to add to your point, I think like another big one is just increasing the user satisfaction.
Yeah, just simply by having a more consistent and streamlined experience.
Exactly.
Nice. And if we were to say, instead of looking from a startup perspective, if we had to look at a large organization, like let's say employees, like companies with employees or a headcount of 100 to 200 people and large development teams, does that change then in terms of business value? Is there something more important, or is there something that we as designers and with a design system can improve on a bigger scale than a startup?
Well, I think a lot of the values, a lot of what we just say would kind of overlap. But I think the important distinction is that in a smaller company, design system is very important and it's nice. It's going to help you a lot. And again, it might, prepare you for future scale, and growth. But for big organization, it's a necessity. Especially if you're dealing with, a bunch of feature teams that are just, are there to work on a single feature. And then you would have like a central, like a design team that would kind of centralize the entire process and would be acting like a link within an organization, kind of tying all these teams together. And I think that the important part is, again, as I mentioned, improve cross-functional collaboration, but also becoming a little bit more efficient at scale, and improving the internal processes. So if you are working in big organization, it's important to have a set of standardized processes, right? So, and it could be like design handoff checklist, right? So every time designers are handing off their stuff to developers, it's consistent and there is nothing missing in there, right? Because this is the way we work, and this is things should be done in this way, and everybody is aligned. Another example could be a quality assurance checklist, right? So, yeah, I think the important distinction is that while in a startup environment, it's a really nice to have thing, and it brings you a lot of value. For big organizations, it's a must. They wouldn't be able to properly function without it.
That's interesting. And just piggybacking on what you just said with the handover, I think, and we touched upon it a bit, but the whole developer-designer relationship kind of strengthens when you have a very strong foundation in terms of a design system. And you mentioned the handover checklist. Just top of mind, if you were to say some of the things you would go through or would imagine seeing in a handover checklist like this between a designer and a developer, what could some of those things be?
It's going to be a classic one, but don't forget the empty states. A good example, right? Proper layer naming structure, right? Do not leave any unnamed layers. I don't want to see frame 3060, that tells me nothing as a developer, right? So proper naming structure, properly structure your component properties, because that will help the developer to understand, a bigger picture in terms of how components should behave. And what are different variations of that same components, because they're able to go to Figma, inspect it, and then they know more or less how it should behave just by looking at that component in isolation, right? So you won't have to, spend tons of time illustrating it in Figma, drawing multiple artboards and, trying to lay it out there. So things like that. And never... just don't forget to use auto layout. I think that's very important.
Okay. And just
in my opinion, because you know how passionate I am about auto layout.
I love auto layout. It's for the people who don't know what that is, both the component variants that could, for example, on a button level, it could be hover and active and disable states, like very primitive, simple settings on a button. And the auto layout, of course, is one of the closest things we have to, at least moving one step closer to developers in terms of being able to use some of the same logic that developers have to use when they code the design we make.
Yeah.
So that's a beautiful thing.
It's essentially it's kind of like almost 1-to-1 to Flexbox.
Exactly.
If you think about it.
Exactly, and that's
the only thing that we're actually missing in Figma is grid, CSS grid.
Yes,
feature.
like a proper scalable, responsive grid.
Yes,
that would be very lovely. We're slowly becoming developers just in Figma. If we were to look out into the landscape of startups or unicorns or big organizations, is there any particular companies that you think are doing a good job in terms of design systems? And I'm thinking also in terms of if somebody listening to this would love to see get some sort of inspiration maybe for their internal teams or their bosses to convince them that this is a good idea, see these guys are doing it very well. Is there somebody you could point at maybe more in terms of who's doing a good job?
Yeah, well, a lot of companies are doing, making great effort in terms of developing their design systems. We had Google Material Design released in, early 2010s. That's a great example, right? It just kind of propelled the entire, web application. And like you started seeing a lot of, kind of web applications and mobile applications using that framework and using those kind of components. And it just allowed companies to move faster outside of Google. Very influential, right? But if I were to pick something that I really like myself, I think it would be Shopify's Polaris. And I will tell you why. I think the fact that they narrowed down the purpose of their design system to only be applied for their admin experience gives them the luxury to not have overly bloated design token setup, right? So you won't have insanely large type scales with too many variations that kind of gets out of hand pretty quickly, right? So I like Polaris because it's not overly bloated. They did a really nice job keeping it slim and only having the things that are absolutely necessary for them.
Nice. Yeah, we love Shopify's Polaris. If you were to suggest a way, talking about Shopify's Polaris, I'm sure they've been through a immense process and iteration phase, and I'm sure they was very bloated initially at some point. If you were to suggest, with the knowledge you have now, for somebody who's interested in looking into design systems and kind of getting that rolling with maybe not like the biggest budget or the most resources in terms of time and people to actually execute on it, where would you start? Like, what would you do if you had to sit down and begin a design system?
Well, I think, again, a good place to start would be, defining the scope, right? Defining the purpose that the design system should serve in the first place. After that is done, I think a good idea is to actually maybe define an ownership. Find a person in your organization that will take part into majority of the decision making related to the design systems, and then also find a way for people to contribute to it. So if you nail these first two steps, I think you will have a healthy foundation. And that's where a lot of, design systems projects fail. Somebody builds them, spending a couple of months in isolation, then they drop it to designers and development teams, and they tell, okay, here you go, just use it. And nobody wants to use it because they weren't even included in the process. Then maybe naming scheme doesn't make sense to them, so I think that's very important. And now speaking about a little bit about practical stuff, right? I think, again, setting up a nice component library, and it doesn't have to be overly bloated. You don't need to start with 20 plus components. This could be, the global stuff, like maybe page headers or your side navigation, whatever it is that lives on every page. This is the best place to start, in my opinion.
Nice. Yeah, I think you mentioned at the office at some point something about a rule of thumb, like when something is a component, like when something becomes a component, or at some stage this should probably be a component, so we can kind of streamline and maintain it. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, so I think if you find yourself using the same component, and imagine that component doesn't exist yet. You're using that same element multiple times. And after 3 or 4 times you used it in a different page or a different place or area in your product, it's a good idea to actually build a component out of it and kind of push it to your component library, contribute it to your component library.
Right, make it available to the whole team, or
exactly.
If you're just developer and designer, that's fine too, but make it accessible, as you said.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even if you have very limited resources, I think even if you contribute one component every single sprint, every 2 sprints maybe, you can have a recurrent task. At the end of the sprint, you take a look at which components would make sense to contribute to the design system. At the end of the year, you'll have a nice inventory, at least a nice set of components that you can work with. And that'll contribute to a lot of time saved.
Yeah.
In the long run.
Absolutely. Okay. So I think we've talked a bit about design systems and what they are and what they can do. I think narrowing it down, because again, I think we talked about it, but the developer-design relationship is so important for design systems to work, because designers are very in the need of developers to develop the designs they make. And designers in the design system is really a way for designers building design systems is really a way to make this process as good as possible, and as high quality as possible. When you look at the current relationship between designers and developers, with the lens of a design system perhaps, but also maybe not necessarily, is there any low-hanging fruit to optimize that relationship in the mundane, granular stuff day to day, but also maybe like take a few steps back and look like overall in the helicopter? Is there anything that like springs to mind in terms of low-hanging fruit?
Well, first of all, if you're working with design systems in your organization, I think, especially if you're not if you're not a part of the development team, it's always good to sit down and have a talk with the developers, and maybe even ask access to their style sheet, to their CSS, global CSS, and take a look at how the naming structure works over there, so you can then name your variables in a way that is familiar for them.
Right.
So just kind of creating this bond with developers, I think it's very important from designers' perspective. We tend to, I think as designers, we tend to be a little bit overwhelmed by all these technicalities and dealing with developers. So a lot of people are not actually willing to do it.
Right.
And I think just being a little bit more open will open a lot of doors for you in the long run. And also when you'll be able to win over the developers' respect. So
that's always good to have the developers' respect. In terms of Figma, for example, we use Figma. A lot of people use Figma. There are other tools. So this goes across Figma, whatever you're using to design and move pixels around. Is there any way in Figma, looking at also smaller teams, but especially larger teams, it doesn't even have to be a large team, but it can just be a very complex product or a suite of products, a SaaS solution having a web platform, but also maybe 2 separate applications and a website, and it just keeps on growing. Is there anything in terms of productivity and clarity in Figma that you see as some big wins in terms of this productivity and clarity for both developers, product owners, or if it's a small team, maybe just a founder? Is there anything you see there that could help?
And we're talking about bigger teams, right?
Yeah, I think in terms of complexity, at least.
Yeah.
The product.
Well, I think we spoke a lot about design tokens lately. I think that could be a nice place to start, especially if we're dealing with multiple products. Maybe we have iOS app.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Just before we continue, can you define design tokens for the people who don't know what that necessarily is?
Essentially, it is a variable that contains a single styling property. So that could be a color, right? A single color. Or it could be, border width, Could be a font weight, or line height. Single property, that's important definition. So if we have, like a typography style in Figma, that wouldn't be a design token, because that style, that Figma style, contains multiple properties in it, if that makes sense for our listeners.
I think it does. Sorry to cut you off. You were talking about if you have an iOS app.
Yeah, if you had an iOS app and then Android app and then a web app, right? Design tokens will help you to kind of streamline the style definition process. So you won't have to have different style sheets for different applications. Because if you're using, I don't know, if we're talking about like dealing with iOS app, you would need to have some sort of, like style defined, maybe in a different syntax, right? It cannot just be CSS. So to simplify this process, we could just have, a single JSON file with all of our design tokens that we're using throughout the organization. And then we can kind of distribute that to all over, wherever we want. It's very universal, right? So
exactly,
it'll work on your website, it'll work on your web app, it'll work on your iOS app.
Right, exactly. Yeah, the design tokens really is a low-hanging fruit in terms of structuring your Figma file as you probably, hopefully, would structure your code base. So we get that alignment.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a low-hanging fruit though, because again, it can get complicated pretty fast. So I don't know if we need to go deep in terms of what design tokens are and different types of it.
I think it's interesting because we spend more and more time on this, especially with our clients becoming a bit more complex in terms of managing their own product development. One thing we've started to do a lot lately is we talk about semantic tokens or colors or anything specific, and then there is a more classical understanding of a specific color or a color scale. I think you can add, if you add a few words to the whole, what are semantics compared to like the standard definition, I would call them, as most people are aware of. What is the differences and why is these semantic colors, not just colors, but tokens in general, very interesting?
Well, first of all, semantic tokens are a little bit easier to digest, to understand. So if you are looking at, the name of the token, so the idea of the semantic token is by looking at the name, you'll more or less get the meaning or the purpose of it. So, I don't know, button, primary, hover, right? What we understand from this? We understand that this is a button background color, primary button color, and we see that color when we hover our mouse over it. So it's a bit technical, but that's pretty much it.
Makes sense.
How it works.
Yeah, so it's kind of, especially if you're working in, again, just honestly, and we see that here too, if we have two designers, you and Oscar, for example, working on the same user interface, him being able to take what you have already established in terms of, let's say, semantic colors, is easier for him to go into Figma and say, I need to design something new. I know I'm designing this specific thing. I can clearly distinguish this purple color, which is just normally just a purple color, and there's a specific hex code that defines that color. He can now see that this should be used in this exact example, like very specifically, as you say, with the background primary button, which helps him immensely, and it keeps this consistency as we want with design systems.
Exactly.
It's very powerful.
Exactly. And just to give some context to the listeners, prior we started working with like semantic tokens, we would be working with like color primitives, right? And so that means that we would publish the entire color scale, and you would have like 10 different shades of purple, right? Or gray, right? And and it's funny, like sometimes you would forget, whether it's gray 200 or gray 100. Okay, so like, and that kind of, I think that's why we started looking into semantic tokens in the first place, or at least started naming them a little bit more clearly.
Exactly. It is more limiting, and that discussion is very widespread. I think, in the design community, in terms of design systems they can kill innovation and creativity, because as soon as we start doing semantic colors as opposed to just primitives, we start limiting ourselves very much, which comes with pros and cons. I don't know if you have any opinions or thoughts around the whole creativity and how we're kind of killing that when we're building a SaaS product or an application or whatever.
Well, again, I watched. I went through a course by Dan Mall, Design Systems 101. Would highly recommend. And he had an interesting take about this entire topic. So most of the time, and he actually showed a real example, a real project that he worked with. And he showed basically a website's landing page. And he was going through individual components. And it appears so that out of all the UI elements, 30% of the elements were taken from the design system. So I think this is important thing to understand for designers and developers and whoever is working the product, is that design system is just for us to help to move faster with the stuff that is a little bit boring. We've done it hundreds of times now. So come on, let's just have that same button and use it all over. But if there is a need for something custom, we should not limit ourselves, especially if we are working with a different, maybe we're working for a special landing page, right? Right now in EDL, we have some things in the pipeline that are going to be slightly different, right? But we're doing it nonetheless, even though we have established our brand guidelines and we're very, we have a design system and we're very structured in terms of that. And so there's still plenty of space for creativity.
Mm. Okay. What, in terms of, you mentioned the 30%, in terms of if you looked at something specific like a user interface and you say 30% of this UI is built with pre-existing design system components, for some that would be a win. For other people, they would see that as like a failure in terms of utilizing the full potential of design system. I know I read somewhere, or I know Pinterest, for example, is a good example of a company who really tries to embrace the design system, like many big companies, as you mentioned. But they made a very interesting article about, they made a tool for Figma that kind of plugged into the code base, and they were able to analyze in every instance of this button, every time we use a button in the UI, is it from the design system or is it custom? And they would be able to say, 86% of all the buttons we use is from this specific design system. Is there anything in terms of looking at a design system and seeing this is a success? And now I'm talking about the craft, not so much about business value necessarily, but of course there's a lot of business value in that. We've already discussed that. But is there anything you look at? Is there any way you would suggest people to look, maybe a product manager or a CPO or a CTO, look at the implementation of a design system in the UI and say, this is a success or this might not be a success? What kind of KPIs are you looking for? Is there anything?
Well, in terms of KPIs, obviously, like in smaller companies, usually it's not a huge practice in terms of tracking design system related KPIs, and I would not necessarily encourage doing that. In big organizations, they need to optimize everything. Of course, they might be looking at the component usage rates and adoption rates, both on the design end and the development. But I think the most important it's not even a metric, but like the most important aspect of a design system is whether people really like it, whether people enjoy using it, whether it's a joy or a pain in the ass. So talk to people in your organization. Do some service. I don't know, maybe you want to be very structured. So I don't know, go on and do some service, If you don't want to be that structured, go and talk to them, casually, and find out what are their thoughts, And you'd be surprised, how many insights you would get out of it. And I think this is kind of the best way to determine whether it actually works or not.
As simple as that. I love it. I think our clients, we have different stakeholders or specific roles that we talk to. So sometimes the person kind of representing and kind of leading the product development in the end of our client could be a product owner, for example. Could also be a technical person, a more technical person, a developer, for example. But is there if you were to suggest something, recommend an approach for let's say a product owner who is building a product, and they might have been building a product for a while now, let's say 6 months, a year, they have clients, everything is going fine. Now they want to, based on listening to this podcast, now they want to establish a design system or at least get started with it. Usually there's somebody above that, like a stakeholder above the product owner, for example. Maybe they're sitting with the resources. Maybe they need to be convinced that this is a good idea and we should spend some research and analysis time and actual take away some precious time from the developers or the designers, who are very, very busy people, take a time away from the daily work and now spend time on this thing over here. What would you recommend them to do in terms of convincing that person if they need to?
Well, first of all, I think the best way to convince anybody is actually give them a glimpse of the potential benefits, right? And most of the time, talking by itself is just not going to cut it, right? So I would always suggest starting out small, maybe it's just one person initiative. And then if you're actually able to bring some sort of value to your team with those efforts, then you can, then it's gonna be the best. It'll really help you to convince the stakeholders, because you'll already be able to demonstrate some of the positive results, right? So I think that's kind of the best place to start. And I know that like in smaller companies, right? Or like also there are bigger companies, but they just prioritize development, and there's like a huge pipeline of features that they need to release. So it's just about releasing a bunch of features, But then again, finding, I don't know, a day maybe, or two, and throughout the entire month, where you can sit down, identify what components can I include to my inventory, and then kind of slowly start building that inventory up. After a couple of months or half a year, you will have some sort of foundation, and obviously if that's helpful, and if it increase the productivity of your team, then it's that'll speak for itself, right?
Right. It becomes a no-brainer.
Because you can
highlight it.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
You can always point at other companies that are doing great, and you can always talk about the benefits, but I think they know that already at this point. Right?
They should. Yes.
So I think it's the best that you can do is to take initiative. And then if you have a nice thing going on, people will come.
Is there anything that you feel like we haven't talked about, or anything you feel like we're missing in terms of approaching design systems?
Honestly, man, I think You've prepared very thoroughly in terms of the questions that you had. So I think we've covered a lot in terms of design systems. So I don't necessarily have much to add.
Yes. Okay.